Okay, so welcome everybody, also to our online audience, to the East Asian Pacific Chief Economist Seminar Series in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. It's our great pleasure to have Roy van der Weide here. Roy arrived on Monday, so he's still a little jet lagged, so please don't be too hard on him. In his presentation, Roy is at DEC AG at the World Bank, based in Washington, D.C. He is a Dutch national and did his PhD at the University of Amsterdam. Roy has worked and is working on issue of poverty and inequality. He will also give a workshop next week on poverty mapping and poverty measurement. And it's our great pleasure to have him here. We feel truly privileged. So without much further ado, I leave the floor to Roy. So Roy told me he likes to speak standing, which I fully understand. But for the online audience, if you cannot understand him well or he is too far away from the mics, please raise your voice and let us know, and then we can make the necessary adjustments. So,
perfect.
Thanks a lot, Roy.
Well, the pleasure is mine, really. What I'll present to you today is very much work in progress, and so we would. But we have reached a point where I think we would greatly benefit from any constructive feedback you may have. And if the joint work that was the effect of which was shared, I think, in the announcement is with Miles Korak. And if time permits, I also included a few slides towards the end of the presentation on a second sort of work in progress with Branko Milanovic that is thematically very closely aligned with his first presentation. Since we're in a small sort of intimate setting, I don't know what the usual format is of this seminar series, but yeah, you should feel free to sort of whenever you have a comment or a question, just speak up. So the presentation of this is on the topic of intergenerational mobility, and arguably the best known empirical stylized fact in the literature on intergenerational mobility is what is known as the Great Gatsby curve, which plots the income elasticity is basically from a regression of child log income, regressed on parent log income, and that sort of the regression coefficient, that slope coefficient, is referred to as the intergenerational income elasticity, plotted against the level of national income inequality lagged, so at the parent generation, if you will. And so that is known to show this clear sort of positive relationship, which shows you that sort of inequality and lack of social mobility go hand in hand, right? So the greater this income elasticity, the lower the social mobility, right? So the larger the extent to which an individual's success in life is contingent on the socioeconomic circumstances that the person is born into, that's referred to as low social mobility. So arguably the factors that are responsible for sort of stimulating inequality in society are some of the shared factors that are also responsible for creating low social.
And Roy, can I just ask out of curiosity, not necessarily related to this, but in general, like, so if you think about Chetty and all's work, thinking about, say, measuring income of father when the child is 3 years old, typically we don't have access to such kind of data. No, they're able to link social security records and really say when you were 3 years old, what was your father's income, and use that to predict, what's the look at intergenerational mobility.
Yeah.
So for some, how strong is that correlation if you were to measure more contemporaneously, like most data would, I guess, tend to do, or all of this income elasticity is really able to look at the income of the father when I was a child?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. So that's a measurement question. Yeah. So Chetty's work indeed uses sort of text record data, and he's able to sort of link one generation to the next through text records. Yeah. That's a very rare situation to be in, right? Other sources are long-running panel data sets, like the PSID in the United States, the SOEP survey in Germany, etc. These are very short. There's maybe like 3, 4, 5 countries in the world where there are long-running panels where you can literally sort of monitor families across multiple generations. So if we were to restrict ourselves to those type of data sets, we would have literally 4 or 5 points in
And
this.
no, but all I was asking was, but they look, so if I was to compare Germany using data, let's say, which was more a standard data users, as compared to using long run nice panel data, are the patterns kind of always borne out? How strong is the measurement error is what I was trying to kind of understand.
So there are certain, I think every approach has its pros and cons. So the work of Chet, for example, he used structured data. The clear benefit is that he's able to sort of observe sort of parental income. The other advantage is that it is a huge number of observations, so he's able to sort of evaluate income ability at very sort of small units, right? Down to the commuting zone and county level, etc. A potential disadvantage is that the typical child in his data set has not yet reached a stage in a person's life cycle where that income level is a good proxy of the lifetime income of that person, right? So very often in this sample, children are in their early 20s or mid 20s, where they're still quite the typical way. The point in short, different ways of measuring income ability will have some pros and cons. And so ideally, if you want to do cross-country comparison work, it's best to try to harmonize as much as possible the method of estimation, right? And that's what we try to do here. So here, what sort of the go-to method is, if you want to compute income ability for a larger number of countries, is what they call this two-sample repeat every approach, right? So much more common is that you have a household survey where you observe the income of the individual interest. It's going to represent the child generation. You don't observe the income of the parent, but you observe parental characteristics like education and maybe occupation of the parents. And so then you appeal to like a mixture type regression.
Okay.
So you combine it with an older survey that is of the time of the parent generation. In that survey, you try to work out the relationship between income and education / occupation, right? So that's the mixture type regression. Once you've identified that relationship in the older survey, you take that relationship to the newer survey where you observe those parental characteristics. You then predict parental income on the basis of those covariates. That's a two-step sort of PSIV sort of setup. And then you regress observed child log income on sort of predicted parental income on the basis of those parental characteristics. That's the type of setup that can be done in a much larger set of countries. And so that's what we did here.
Okay.
What we did here is it's a combination of these things together. So we took the equal chance database, so that for those of you who haven't heard of that and you're interested in this topic, I would encourage you to look it up. It's a database that offers very meticulously sort of obtained sort of estimates of income ability and very stringent sort of checks on sort of cross-country comparability and harmonization, etc. We took that as a point of departure. Then we did an exhaustive sort of screening of the existing literature, added estimates for countries that were not yet covered by the equal chance database, and then on top of that, we computed some of our own measured income ability, most notably for lower income countries. Like you'll see if you end up browsing the academic literature on income ability, there is a bit of a bias towards higher income countries, right? So the original literature focused on the United States, on Sweden, Denmark, UK, France, Germany. In fact, if you look at the original paper by Miles Kodak in 2013, Journal of Economic Perspectives, where I think it's one of the first papers that established the Great Gatsby curve, it was like 13 countries, they're all high income. At the World Bank, we also are very much obviously interested in lower income countries, and these tend to be underrepresented in the existing literature. So many of the countries where we sort of computed our own estimates tend to be the lower income countries that we added to the database. In the case of Malaysia, by the way, since we're in Malaysia, the estimate comes from a PhD thesis of Nathan Groh. He's one of the scholars that is active in this field. So that's the part where I told you, like we also sort of did this exhaustive sort of screening of the exact literature. We took estimates where we could. Malaysia is one of those countries. It's unfortunately one of the countries that we couldn't get out. So we know the estimates because that number has been cited so many times. But we couldn't actually download his PhD thesis. So we know what he did. We know the specification he adopted. We know the number.
We don't have to do that.
But it's somehow difficult to get access to the underlying material. And that brings us to actually to a question to you guys. If any of you know of any more recent, up-to-date empirical study that was done on Malaysia, estimating sort of intergenerational income mobility. I'm all ears. I couldn't find it, but you may know more than I do. So please share it with me if you know of another intergenerational income study on Malaysia. Anyway, a potential, perhaps lesser known stylized fact in the literature on intergenerational is the positive relationship between socioeconomic mobility and national income. Right? Remember that higher values of that income elasticity indicate lower levels of mobility. So the fact that its income elasticity goes down as sort of the national income of the country increases, is that national sort of as countries tend to go richer, they manage to achieve higher levels of national income. Then the next question, how is it exactly? And that's the subject of our study here. The question we're asking in the study is, how is it that countries are able to achieve higher levels of social mobility as they grow richer? What are the typical sort of pathways through which that is achieved?
And can I ask you one more measurement question? Or
Yeah, no, please go ahead.
So if you were to create measures of, say, intergenerational educational mobility, say like Elias and Stelios' recent work, for instance, for Africa.
We have a nice paper on that subject as well.
Okay, and they are strongly positively correlated, these two measures?
I'll show you, there's actually a graph in the presentation where I'll show you the relationship.
Okay, super.
Yeah, so they are definitely positively correlated. Yeah. But
and you can say something about the timing, or you are going to hint.
Well, the timing is, but you'll see is that they're obviously correlated, but they're not going to nicely line up tightly across the economy. So there are differences. There will be countries that do well in terms of education mobility, for example, but not so well in terms of income mobility. Okay. And that tells you something about the functioning of the labor market, right? So people may be operating on a level playing field as far as attaining education, but once people enter the labor market and sort of jobs are in short supply, you may end up in a situation where sort of those good jobs are predominantly available to well-connected individuals tapping into those the relevant networks, right? And so most of the inequality of opportunity, if you will, might sort of materialize in the labor market, and that's when the typical situation where you may see a disconnect between education mobility and income. So it's interesting to look at that relationship precisely because it sort of isolates the role of the labor market. So the question we're trying to ask in this sort of work in progress is how countries achieve higher levels of intergenerational mobility as they grow rich. Now, we thought like a natural point of departure is the theoretical literature, right? Of trying to identify candidate channels. Much of this dates back to the work by Becker and Toms, who built their first theoretical model, published the first theoretical model in the 70s, and many scholars have since built on that framework. We adopted the Gary Solon in 2004 published a paper. There are many alternative models you could pick, but they're all more or less in the same spirit. All of them are built on the Becker-Toms framework. So just to give you a quick sort of overview of the main ingredients of that model. So parents allocate their after-tax earnings, 1 minus tau yi, I is family I, and T subscript indicates a generation. So T is the child, T minus 1 is the parent's generation of family I. So parents allocate their after-tax earnings between consumption spending and investments into the children's human capital. Okay, consumption indicated by capital C and investments into child human capital, capital I. In this model, we assume that parents cannot borrow against the prospective earnings of the child and they don't make requests. Okay. There are other models that sort of relax that assumption. It depends how realistic you find it that people can borrow against future earnings of their children.
And do you think bequest is kind of one of the important mechanisms that you are thinking about when you want to capture income mobility features?
So I personally think it is more realistic to shut off that channel because I think it's difficult to come up with a realistic scenario where people the whole idea of introducing requests is that people can make negative requests. right? So sure, people may make positive requests, but the whole idea of introducing requests is to allow for the possibility of negative requests, where poor families can potentially borrow against student, right? They can make a big investment in children. These children hopefully will then generate higher earning when they reach sort of the age 14, and they borrow against those future earnings. It's I think it's not common.
Not realistic, yeah.
It's not realistic that that's possible. So for that reason, we shut off that channel, and so did Gary. But there are models where that features there. Qualitatively, sort of a lot of the things I will tell you will carry over. Where was I? Okay, so child human capital indicated by age, IT, is jointly determined by the private investments that parents make into the human capital of children, as well as government investments, public investments. And you think of like public schooling, vouchers, free program, schooling programs, etc. So there's many ways in which sort of public investments can aim at increasing the human capital of children. This also includes health, right? So health expenditures, etc. Anything that stimulates the cognitive development of the child. So very broadly, public expenditures, very broadly, that sort of that are aimed at improving the human capital of children. And the human production technology function is indicated by the function over there. And there is a term EIT that captures sort of factors other than public and private investment in capital. So think of it as innate ability of the child, think of it as peer effects, think of it as social networks, sort of some of these other factors that sort of end up determining human capital beyond the investments that are made into the child. And following Becker and Tom's, that variable is assumed to satisfy this first or the other regressive process with lambda as the other regressive coefficient. Then finally, child income is determined by this means of type equation. So the log of income of the child is this intercept mu plus this term here with P indicating the returns to education. Okay, any questions so far? So this gives you like a very quick sort of overview of sort of the solo model that we will be working with. Okay, so then parents maximize the Cobb-Douglas type function, right? So there's their own consumption. Again, their income is spread their own consumption and investment in the child human capital. And alpha is this altruistic parameter. Yes. Yep.
So E is innate ability, and it depends on your parents.
It's not just innate ability. So I labeled it here as innate ability because I only have finite space. So think of it as innate ability, peer effects, social networks, sort of other variables that may drive child human capital beyond the private and public investments that are made into child human capital.
Because I would think if that's the case, if it's broader definition, then won't the AR process depend on your parents' human capital rather than their own EI?
But these two are related, right? So this is the EI is an input into the child human capital, parent human capital as well, right?
My sense was this was some kind of memory throughout the generation of your human capital investment, but that's not what it is.
But it is. But the type of variables that you should think of definitely have like this persistence aspect to them, right? So if it's innate ability, so the genetic transmission is a persistence component. If it is social networks, that you would expect that to carry over over time, right? People inherit each other's social networks. Peer effects is the neighborhoods you grew up in, etc. So a lot of the variables that they have in mind, or that Gary, or actually this is purely built on sort of backup. It's not something sort of.
This is not some persistence of investment. This is
No. Exactly. No. Exactly.
The environment, basically.
Exactly. It's the environment, genetic component, and some of these other variables that are, in fact, beyond investment.
Okay.
You can just clarify a question of the preferences. I mean, the investment decision is not related with the income of with the education of the parents, right?
It is, right? Because the education of the parents determines their income.
Okay.
Right? And then given that income, they allocate the income to either their own private consumption or the investment into the children, and then they maximize, right? So they maximize the utility function, and that alpha coefficient tells something about, I mean, they call it the altruism sort of coefficient, right? The greater that coefficient, the more weight they attach to maximizing the future earnings of their children. And then when you solve for that model, you obtain this optimal private investment into the children human capital. And for brevity here, I didn't include the expression here, but what I will say is that it's a linear function. So this optimal investment is a linear function of, and it shows you that holding public investments constant, the government is constant, parents that have more education and greater income end up spending more than the children, as you would logically expect. Similarly, the altruistic coefficient, parents who have like a greater altruism coefficient end up spending more in the children. The second thing that sort of follows from that is that public investments, public investments partially crowd out private investments, but not fully.
Can I ask a clarifying question, actually? So in this case, are we thinking about each parents making individual choices for each children that they have and not taking
Each parent is assumed to have one child, so for it to make things more tractable. Yeah. Thus, most of the models sort of make a simplifying assumption. It quickly becomes less tractable if you introduce multiple children. I think there are some papers, but it's by and large papers sort of assume one child per parent.
Why is public investment family specific?
Why is public? Because, for example, you want to allow for the possibility that what else? So that you're actually already going to the next point. Yeah. So that's up to the model to decide, right? So this is actually something where Gary Solon differs. This is pretty much up to that point. It's very much literally sort of taking over the Beckett-Thompson framework. This is something he introduced.
No, I haven't gone to. I'm just looking at the subscript.
Public investment.
G has a subscript I on and on.
Yeah, exactly. So that's something Gary introduced to this paper. So the GI actually in the Beckett-Thompson framework, I don't think the GI is even there. Beckett has a more recent paper with some shortly before he passed away, where he did have a new theoretical model that introduces government investment, but his original work, government investment, didn't really play a role. So the idea here is that you could allow for progressive public investments, right? So that sort of families that sort of have lower income and sort of come from a more disadvantaged background, that they receive more, right? So think of like preschool programs targeted at sort of poor families. For example, think of school vouchers that give you access to a good school if you live in a neighborhood where schools are not so great. Right? So it's just to introduce this idea, but you're not limited to shut it off. Like if you make this gamma 0, right? Then it's no longer family specific. It will be the same for everyone. But sort of the whole idea of Gary Solon's paper, he wants to investigate like what is the role of introducing more progressive sort of public investments that sort of provide greater assistance to families in needs.
But it's exogenous for the household. The household just sees this as a public investment that I get, that I take advantage of.
Sorry, what do you mean?
That it's not either or. It's not a model where there is a government option I can take, or I can opt for the private option. You don't have this dichotomy. It's like
it's people
from the perspective of the household, the government investment, what I get from the government in terms of education services and exogenous.
Yeah, so the household qualifies for a certain amount of investment set, right? And on condition on that, they adjust their own private investment.
They adjust their own exactly.
But
I mean,
and that's what I mean.
From the perspective of the household is exogenous. It's just given their
exactly. Yeah, it's determined by sort of the income, right? So they know if they're a poorer family, they're entitled to say more public assistance. So based on their income profile, they know what they're entitled to in terms of public investment. And on condition on that, they adjust their own private investment. So that brings us to this sort of in Gary's sort of model, public investment is modeled as like this share of public investment, evaluated as the the family income is modeled by this switch over here, where the star fee basically just sort of shift the overall public investment that goes to every child. But allowing for this gamma to be positive, you introduce the possibility of making public investment more progressive, where households with lower levels of income receive more competitively more public assistance. Okay, so anytime, yeah.
But public investment is a choice.
What do you mean?
I mean, it's another for exogenous.
What do you mean with a choice?
Someone is choosing G to maximize
The
something.
government uses G, not the household.
And what is the objective?
So it's exogenous to the household.
And what is the objective function of the government? Or the government is not in the model?
The government is not in the model.
So in the model, G is exogenous.
I mean, strictly sort of in spirit, the objective of the government is trying to level the playing field a little bit, right? So they acknowledge that sort of households, the children from more privileged backgrounds are twice fortunate, right? That parents typically have more income available to invest in children. On top of that, they tend to be more educated, so there's also more direct sort of transmission of human capital. And so introducing progressive public investment is an effort to try to level the playing field.
Okay.
Beyond that, the government is not sort of formally modeled.
Perfect. But as an object in the model, it's exogenous.
Exogenous, and it's there to level the playing field.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. Nothing more than that.
No, but I mean, I don't know, it's not exhaust, I mean, it's determined within the model, right? The level of G will be determined because it depends on income distribution.
It's not modeled in the sense that there is no objective function of the government that is being formally optimized. Yeah. Okay, so that's literally the whole model in a nutshell. So given that sort of dynamic model, we can evaluate, as Solon did, the sort of the steady state equilibrium values for some of the critical parameters. Beta is that intergenerational income elasticity, right? So regressing log income. And so just imagine that this model is an accurate approximation of the real world. Suppose that the data we observe in the log incomes for children and parents sort of satisfy that model. If you would, then this beta would be the regression of log income of the children, regressed of log income of the parents, and beta would be that sort of that slope parameter, the intergenerational income elasticity. Within this model, you can evaluate what the steady state value of that coefficient will be as a function of all the model parameters. Similarly, we can work out what the variance of log income is. Think of that as a measure of income inequality. And we can work out what the expected value of mean log income is. Think of that as a proxy of whatever the average income or the national income level of that society that's being modeled. Okay. Now the income persistence parameter is seen to be a positive function of theta and p. So remember, p is the returns to education. Theta was the returns on. Theta was the sort of is closely related to the return on investments, right? So private and public investments are made to the child human capital. The theta tells you sort of how much of human capital these investments generate, right? So higher value of theta means a greater return on those public and private investments. P is return to education, and gamma was the progressivity parameter. So positive values of gamma means that disadvantaged families receive more public assistance. Okay, so you see that as greater returns on investment and greater returns on education generate higher income elasticities, right? So lower intergenerational mobility. More progressive public investments means lower intergenerational elasticity, so higher income mobility. So that's more what you, at least certainly the latter part, what you would expect, right? You would expect that as that public investment scheme becomes more progressive, that does end up leveling the playing field, meaning that social mobility goes up, right? It becomes less important whether the child is born into an advantage or disadvantage family background in determining the economic success of that child. Similarly with inequality, sort of great returns. Inequality is also positively related to the returns to education, the return for investment, and it's negative related again to the progressivity parameter, as you would expect. When public investment becomes more progressive, inequality in the society goes down. The mean income, the mean log income in society is also positively related to returns on investment, as you might expect, right? So it's if the technological, so the production function, human capital becomes more efficient, you make an investment of a certain amount of value, and if that investment is able to generate a greater delta human capital, right? So more efficient sort of conversion of investment into delta human capital is associated with sort of higher national income in society. Similarly, higher returns to education means higher income. That's also what you would expect. And then mean income is the only one that is a function of both gamma and this far row. So notice that far row was like the shift parameter in public spending. So the bigger far row, the bigger sort of public spending gets sort of increased for all households, regardless of what their level of income is. Whereas gamma just controls the progressivity. So the far row is not relevant for beta and inequality, as you might expect, but it is of course going to have a relationship with mean log income. Now, the overall effect of the public sort of spending scheme is on national income determines how these two sort of move together, right? You would expect then, even though mechanically they might not be related, but you would expect them to sort of change sort of pairwise, right? So imagine if a country has like a budget constraint of some sort, whatever that budget constraint might be. If you change one parameter, right, that's going to, without changing the other one, that's going to change the overall amount of public resources that are being allocated. And so if there's some kind of budget constraint at work, you would expect that when you change one, the other one is going to sort of change in order to maintain sort of the public constraint, right? So if you want to have a sense of how that public sort of scheme shapes national income, you need to also have some kind of understanding of how those two parameters sort of co-vary. And so for each acquisition, we introduce a budget constraint that has the following form. That average public spending is just some fraction of average income in the household. And this is some parameter G that captures sort of the average fraction of after-tax, average after-tax earnings. Okay, so that completes the model. Any questions so far? Because now we can sort of try to rationalize those two stylized specs I introduced you at the beginning. Yeah, you sure? Yeah. Okay. So remember what those two stylized specs were? We saw this positive relationship between the income elasticity, beta, and inequality. And we saw this negative relationship between the income elasticity and national income. Now, it turns out that within this model and many of the other models that sort of have been developed in the literature, it's very easy to reproduce the Great Gatsby curve, that positive relationship between the income elasticity and inequality, right? So again, let's assume that this model sort of accurately describes the various societies that we observe in the world, but countries vary in the values of those parameters, right? So we may see cross-country variation in the return to education. We may see cross-country variation in the efficiency of that human capital production technology function, right? We may see cross variation in the progressivity of public investments, et cetera, right? So just imagine that this model provides a very nice approximation to each individual country, but countries vary in the values of those structural parameters. Okay? Now, let's imagine that sort of countries predominantly vary in, yes, Adam?
Roy, we have a question online.
Okay.
Professor Liang, you mind unmuting yourself?
Thank you. So the question relates to this literature about the role of public policy in addressing inequality, and particularly if you compare Europe versus US. So the argument is that, well, why is inequality high in one part and the other? And increasingly people are talking about redistributed public policy. Right? So where instead of relying on tax, so you kind of approach inequality through the lens of inequality of opportunity. And again, that's where I was thinking that beyond budget constraint, you would think of political constraint, that well, voters would then kind of promote and support certain policies, particularly which are kind of more predistributive in nature. And given that this model is supposed to motivate your empirical analysis moving forward, I was just wondering that how do we go from here to the next part? Because, so your work is about growth, inequality and mobility. And then you start with that, graph. And I was just wondering that, well, if we are to sort of reimagine this instead of inequality of outcomes, but inequality of opportunities, and then how will that graph look like? And again, coming back to this issue of switching from redistributive public policy regime to one of predominantly predistributive regime, how will you sort of tie that up with your model here? Because you're talking about level of spending, yes, but there is the orientation part of the public policy, which would be helpful for me to sort of understand how do you go from here to there, that, well, these public policy parameters that you talk about that, I mean, of course, I might be jumping ahead that, well, and should wait for your empirical analysis, but I thought I would just seek some clarification on this. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your question. I'm not sure I caught all of what you said, but you mentioned something at the beginning about this comparison, for example, within the United States and Europe, and that sort of social probabilities of be somewhat higher in Europe than in the United States. Well, part of that could, for example, in this case, be explained by public policy in Europe being more progressive than public policy in the United States, right? That would explain why you would see higher levels of income mobility in, say, Denmark and Sweden, the Nordic countries, than you would see in the United States. I think of, and not just me, sort of people often associate income mobility with equality opportunity, right? So you mentioned inequality opportunity, that is sort of closely related. I don't know if you were making a reference to the formal literature on inequality opportunity, which there is. If that was the case, sort of the literature, for those who are maybe not familiar with the literature, so the literature on inequality of opportunity tries to capture the extent to which inequality in outcomes, say inequality in child income, to what extent that is shaped by factors that are beyond the control of that individual. Now, the literature on intergenerational mobility does exactly that. It just focuses on one specific variable that is beyond the control of the child, right? Which is parental income. Children don't choose their parents, and they don't choose sort of the parental income. Whereas the literature on inequality of opportunity does exactly that. It just expands the set of sort of circumstances that are beyond control. It adds variables like gender, race, religion, the location where you were born, etc., etc. If that didn't fully address, maybe we can return to the question further down the road. But so I think this is a point where we can try to square that stylized model that Gary Solon developed with those two empirical stylized specs that we introduced outside, right? So we see that if countries predominantly vary in their returns to education, right? We see that higher returns of education are associated with higher income elasticity. They're also associated with higher inequality. So that in itself would explain that first aspect, the Great Gatsby curve, right? Indeed, sort of higher inequality tends to be associated with higher income elasticities. So cross-country variation in terms of education would be consistent with the Great Gatsby curve. The same with the parameter theta. I didn't do the slide because it would be exactly the same thing. If we have greater returns on investments, right? If countries vary across that dimension, we would see we would be able to reproduce nicely that positive correlation between income elasticity and national income in the country. What is a little bit harder to square is a second style aspect. The fact that as countries go richer, we tend to observe higher levels of income. So, for example, cross-country variation between education, while it rationalizes the Great Gatsby curve, it doesn't rationalize that second style aspect, right? Because higher returns of education are associated with higher levels of national income, but lower levels of intergenerational mobility, right?
Yeah.
Higher levels of income system. So if countries predominantly vary in returns to education, or they predominantly vary in the returns on investment in the human capital production function. We can rationalize the gradient figures, but we cannot rationalize that second style effect. So clearly something more would be required to square both of these style aspects. Okay, so what about cross-country variation in the progressivity, which also touches on the question that was raised? Right, so comparison to the United States and the Nordic countries comes to mind here. So that is able to sort of, that sits well with both of these aspects. So again, to recap, if we have two countries, one is more progressive than the other. The more progressive country, given the budget constraint that I introduced, you can work out that it is associated with higher levels of average log income. It's also associated with higher levels of income ability through lower intergenerational persistence.
Can I ask, so and what does the last one, what does it crucially hinge on? That it's associated with higher log income progressivity was a key assumption that drives it, because one standard, let's say, argument in favor of inequality is that it's going to have higher incomes, right?
So inequality, but inequality is driven by multiple factors. One of them is inequality opportunity, as sort of Nias pointed out.
Yeah.
And so there is an empirical literature that so if let me take a step back. If you look at the empirical literature that tries to work out what is the relationship between total national income inequality and growth, it's a very tricky literature with effects going in both directions. Some find slightly positive, some slightly negative, most find a zero effect, and it's very sensitive to sort of the choice of specification. Since then, there have been efforts trying to sort of decompose inequality into different factors. Think of an inequality opportunity component and a residual inequality component. Think of it like good cholesterol, bad cholesterol. The inequality opportunity component, think of it as the higher it is, the less people operate on a level playing field, right? So you may end up in a society where inequality is very high. It's a society where perfectly talented children, simply by being born into impoverished circumstances, may end up in a situation where they're unable to fulfill their potential. And so human capital ends up getting lost, right? It ends up getting wasted. So a lot of talent will simply sort of get wasted. That empirical literature, once they decompose total inequality into inequality opportunity and its residual, and the residual inequality, think of it as, it's termed in the literature as inequality of effort, right? So there are definitely positive components of inequality. Societies that reward risk-taking, societies that reward people that invest greater efforts, reap the benefits of those investments and that risk-taking, right? So a society where all of that is being discouraged, right? Risk-taking and working harder doesn't come with any rewards. That will depress sort of investments. It will depress ultimately national income, right? So I think we can all agree that a residual component is positive. That's precisely why it's so difficult. Let me first say that inequality component is found to have a strong negative relationship with economic growth, right? So once you decompose total inequality into inequality opportunity and residual inequality, even though total inequality has a rather ambiguous and inconclusive relationship with economic growth, once you decompose inequality into these two factors, they find that inequality of opportunity has a clear negative relationship with growth, right? And again, the thinking is that because these are societies where a lot of human potential ends up getting wasted, right?
Yeah,
which is very inefficient. And then once you control for inequality opportunity, that residual inequality that is associated with society that rewards risk-taking and investment, etc., that becomes positive. Mm-hmm. And that also explains why that studies that look at total inequality in growth, that's rather inclusive, because total inequality is a sum of two components. One has a clear negative relationship with growth, whereas the other positive. And so the sum of these two ends up having a rather sort of ambiguous relationship. So yeah, so the idea being, and that public investment tries to sort of battle a little bit the wasting of human potential, right? So if you have perfectly talented children, but if they're left to their own devices, right? They grow up in a public playground, they don't have access to decent schools, etc. That talent ends up getting wasted. And so these public investments that are aimed at leveling the playing field, making sure that kids that are talented are given the opportunity to sort of fulfill their potential is efficiency enhancing, right?
Yeah, no, I was just asking about the fact that in the model that this, to get this sign, you have to make this assumption that the government expenditure is aimed at this is improving this
Yeah.
part component.
But that's what gamma kept is. So the more positive gamma is, the more it targets children from disadvantaged backgrounds.
Yeah.
So the more the public policy sort of tries to level the playing field, the greater is income, the lower is inequality, and the greater is socioeconomic mobility. So if countries vary in the level of progressivity of this public investment, that is able to fit well with both the style aspects. It explains this relationship between inequality and intergenerational income system, but it also explains this positive relationship.
But yeah, I see the point exactly, but I think that kind of relates to what Niaz was kind of trying to hint at, to say that, if you roll this back one step further,
Yeah.
you could think about the fact that people's perception about government spending, and imagine the government spending is identical across contexts. Let's say, thinking about Europe and the United States,
Yeah.
the political perception, and that's what I think Niaz was pointing to, as going to roll it back one step, is that people think of these expenses as, in your framework and in the European world, many people think of it as attacking this inequality of opportunity, and it's great for growth, and there is political support. Whereas in the United States, exactly same component is thought of being as, distortionary, it's going to dismotivate efforts. So, for your, I see the point that you want to make in the context of making this, putting up the stylized facts and this, but I think that the same is, that is not the clean-cut world of thinking about.
I think that's a fair point. Yeah, so perception may well be different, and this type of policies may receive a warmer welcome in Europe than it receives here. Even though I do think that's slowly changing. Like 15, 20 years ago, like politicians wouldn't dare to use the word inequality. I think that has changed. I think politicians, there's now a political environment in the US where it becomes more palatable to address inequality, specifically if they address inequality opportunity. So I think a focus on total inequality is still a sensitive issue, but I think tackling inequality of opportunity can count on a broader base of support now, also in the United States. Maybe not yet.
Maybe we are digressing a little. We have less than 15 minutes left.
Okay, so I should go much faster then. Maybe save it for a little bit later because I'm going way slower than anticipated. Okay, so just up to this point, in the pure solar model that is built on Becker and Toms, right? It turns out that there is one channel, one only, that there is no way to rationalize society without introducing public interventions, right? So public interventions are very much required. So any pathway that will explain the data involves public intervention. Okay, so now what we try to do is, can we think of a potential other pathway if we introduce heterogeneity in the model, right? So now think of like having two groups, which we indicate by H and L. You can either think of them as elites or non-elites, or leading areas and lagging areas within society, right? And so the elites have higher returns on investment, higher returns on education, etc., than the non-elites. And so this allows for the possibility of convergence following a period of divergence. So think the type of sort of scenario that we have in mind is that in a very early stage of development, think of a poor country, elites may be the initial driver of growth in the country, right? There's not enough resource to go around. And so elites become the driver of growth. National income goes up, but as they are getting their growth, they also separate themselves from sort of the rest of the country. And then hopefully at some point there will be a transition where the focus will shift on having the non-elites or the laggings catch up to elites, right? Following after that transition, the non-elites become the engine of growth, right? Because as the non-elites start to catch up with elites, so now this is why national income is increasing. While at the same time, as we have this phase of convergence, inequality will come down, and potentially also intergenerational will go up, right? So that's sort of the scenario we have in mind. We do heterogeneity because we acknowledge that elites become the initial engine of growth. During the initial growth phase, inequality goes up, and presumably income mobility goes down. But as the country transitions And that transition will involve, again, public investment, right? It's hard to see lagging areas or only catching up to the needs without public investment. So public investments can take a back seat in that initial phase of growth, but it's different type of public investment. So we think of this gamma, this targeted public investment, as school vouchers, of preschool programs that target the poor. We think of like that's this convergence where you want to close the gap in the returns on investment, for example, or the returns to education, as trying to tackle labor market inequalities, try to tackle gaps in school quality, right? It's a different type of public thing. Rather than having a country where you have lots of variations in school quality and you give a child in a poor neighborhood a voucher that allows that child to attend a good school, right? This data, we think of public investments, you know what, trying to lift the low quality schools to the level of the good quality schools, so that we have like a more equitable sort of school quality across the country. But again, it will involve a role of public investment. So that's the second sort of channel that we're going to look at. So in this case, mean income among the elites or leading areas exceeds mean income among the non-elites. Inequality tends to be higher because we know that higher returns education and higher returns investment is associated with higher inequality. And the income elasticity among the elites is higher than the income elasticity for the. Okay. Now, this also introduces a between group inequality component, capital B, right? So total inequality, we have this within group inequality, within the elites, with those, plus is B, and this B captures the income differences between the elites and the non-elites. And that B also plays an important role in determining the aggregate income elasticity, right? So the income elasticity is going to be a weighted average of the income elasticities within the two groups, but it's also a function of that between group component. So when the between group component goes down, the income elasticity goes down. Okay, so now what are the various policies, right? So let's assume that the country is transitioned towards that phase of convergence, where it's trying to lift the returns education of the knowledge to the higher returns education of workers, for example, by tackling labor market inequality, right? What does that do, right? So we see that this introduces three components. Someone have a question? This first term is positive, right? Because we know that if we introduce the returns to education, in this case of the non-elites, that's going to introduce a higher value of the income elasticity for the non-elites. The other terms are negative. For example, if you facilitate convergence by lifting the non-elites to the elites, the between group inequality component goes down. The income elasticity in aggregate is smaller than 1, so this term is positive, but this is negative. And this term is also negative because increasing the reduced education of the elites will increase inequality, but the persistence of the non-elites is lower than the aggregate increase. So this term is also negative. Okay, so we have two negative terms and one. So in principle, the aggregate sort of effect of facilitating convergence, right, closing the gap between the non-elites and the elites, could go either way. When the share of elites is very small, then we're almost in like a homogeneous scenario, right? So if that share of elites is very small, then society is sort of approximated by the non-elites alone. And so then we're almost in the old case where if we're going to lift the intergenerational education of the elites, of the non-elites, we get more or less the same sort of patterns we introduced earlier. So that beta is predicted to increase. Okay, so in that case, trying to lift the non-elites to elites is not going to have the desired effect. However, when the elites reach a critical mass, okay, so when that between inequality component becomes sufficiently large, and these other terms start to sort of take effect, then we're in a situation where lifting the non-elites will become a positive for income mobility, right? So that's when these other two terms that are negative become larger and larger and larger. At some point, they're going to dominate So again, once that initial phase where the elites where the initial growth, once that group becomes large enough, at some point we reach a situation where investing in catch-up growth will both generate national income growth while simultaneously improving socioeconomic mobility. But still, so now this is a second pathway, but bear in mind, both pathways that allow us to rationalize these critical style aspects that I briefly outlined have a role for government. So none of the pathways we could find within sort of this exercise are we able to rationalize the style aspect where we see no role for government, right? So there's no invisible hand here that is able to reproduce those style aspects without having a role for government. Migration to opportunity. So that's a different way. So let's just quickly cover that as well. So you can try to facilitate convergence through public investment, right? By lifting, say, school quality. If the gap is through the fact that we have like low quality schools and high quality schools, and the non-elites have access to low quality schools, well, lifting the poor quality schools will close that gap. Tackling labor market inequality will close the gap in terms of education between elites and non-elites. Something that doesn't require public investment per se is people move to opportunity, right? So you can if it's between leading and lacking areas, say, people from the lacking areas who decide to move to the places where we have better schools, better services, access to better jobs, etc. So what does that do? So that's just to being open to the possibility of maybe being able to square those two style aspects without seeing a role for government. But it doesn't work. So migration here is, so we abstract away from general equilibrium effect. So migration is modeled as simply keeping everything else equal, right? So governments doesn't make any efforts to sort of increase the return to education of the elites or to increase the return on investment among the elites. All that we're doing here, right, we keep that the same. We just increase the share of the population that lives in areas with the good services and reduce the share of the population that lives in areas with the lower quality service, right? So it's simply just migration without changing the quality of the service in those. So that will increase national income. If people migrate towards places where they can become more productive, will increase national income, okay? But it will also increase inequality, and it will increase the intergenerational income elasticity. So again, it is able to rationalize the Great Gatsby curve. So remarkably, like you introduce cross-calibration in any parameter, you're able to rationalize the Great Gatsby curve. That positive relationship between income mobility and national income is much, much harder to rationalize. So migration doesn't cover it, right? Because if people migrate, yes, income goes up, but also does the income elasticity will go up. Okay, so it doesn't square. So the only way we can square is like a role for public government.
What if selection was extremely negative at the source where then we would rationalize the facts, no? Suppose there was very negative selection in this case that people with the worst incomes, suppose have the worst human capital and incomes, have the highest incentives to migrate. Would that rationalize here? Then you have the people who are, these are the people then who are at the bottom of the stack and they start catching up.
Let me make a note of that. Let me give it some thought before I.
This depends on the question of how you will then think about cost of migration in some sense. No?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, if it's low, then you could have very negative selection kicking in.
That's a good point. And let's think a little bit more about that. But the main take with this point is basically what we're trying to get across is that there are many possible pathways, right? Almost every pathway explains the Great Gatsby curve, but it's very hard to come up with a theoretical sort of rationalization of that positive relationship between income mobility and national income without introducing a role for government. That's sort of, there's no invisible hand sort of story here as far as we can tell. So I can wrap up this briefly with giving you a brief sense of, this is also where we would welcome your feedback. So this is great feedback, but we welcome also your feedback on sort of what we view as the way forward. is we're going to do a simulation study, right? Where again, we take the model seriously as an approximation to the real world, and we're going to simulate. We can isolate one channel at a time. We can simulate two channels, sort of mechanisms, simultaneously, and we can also then investigate the relative importance of one channel versus the next, right? We can investigate the short-term dynamics versus long-term dynamics, right? To change something that may introduce like a short-term effect on say income ability, that may then sort of fade off again in the long term as things settle into equilibrium. So these are the things we can investigate by means of simulation studies. We're going to do some empirical investigation into the relative importance of these channels, because ultimately, right, so we now have a couple of candidate mechanisms, this sort of divergence convergence story, variation progressivity, while at the same time some of these other channels may be pushing net income mobility in another direction. Ideally, we want to get some sense of relative sort of importance of these channels, but we feel like there might be also a lot of merit in conducting case studies, right? So what we're ultimately thinking of doing, and this is probably going to be the most laborious part of the sort of future work, is ultimately we want to get a sense of how do different countries achieve higher income and simultaneously higher sort of mobility, but different countries may achieve it in slightly different ways, right? So through these case studies, we hope to sort of get a better sense of like the US, for example, may achieve it through ultimately by making its public investment more progressive by introducing school values, whereas Sweden might say, you know what, we're just going to make sure that all low-quality schools are lifted to. Different countries may go about it in different ways, and we're hoping of sort of shedding more light on this question by just doing an in-depth investigation on a suitable set of case studies. Now it begs the question as to how do we choose those countries that we can't possibly cover the whole world. It's going to be sort of too time consuming. Here we were thinking of relying on empirical data to help us guide with the selection of case studies. So what are some of the empirical style aspects we could appeal to? Well, the first is we could empirically check, are there any countries in the world that managed to grow rich and simultaneously achieve comparatively high levels of income mobility, low levels of inequality opportunities, while keeping public spending low, right? We would argue that's very hard, right? Based on this theoretical framework, we would predict it's very difficult to grow rich as a country, simultaneously achieve higher levels of income mobility while keeping public spending low. But it's something we can empirically observe. We can simply check sort of public spending for each country. You have estimates of the level of GDP and the estimates of income mobility. It turns out there are three countries.
I was curious.
Yeah. There are three countries that are comparatively rich and have comparatively higher levels of income mobility with low public spending, and we suspect these are countries where we have high levels of private spending into services. The three countries that is South Korea, your neighbor Singapore, and Switzerland. So based on the first aspect, one or more of those three countries make a suitable candidate for like a case study analysis.
And how do you, what is defined by your definition of low public spending?
Oh, simply total public spending. We also look at total public spending on education as a share of GDP.
Okay, and that these countries still stand out as spending relatively very low.
Yeah, here it is. So this is here we visit. This is net income. This is the income elasticity.
Yeah.
And the red dots are countries with comparatively low public spending. And those three dots over here is Korea, Switzerland, and Singapore. This is another style aspect. Is as somebody mentioned at the earlier stage, is the ratio between income mobility and education mobility, right? Because this is what we do here. This is the elasticity in education, plotted against the elasticity in income. And so, yes, they are positively correlated, but they don't line up perfectly along straight lines. So you do have countries that, given their level of education mobility, have particularly low levels of income mobility. Countries that stand out is the MENA countries, Tunisia, Egypt. And these are countries where presumably, some would argue that even played a role in the Arab Spring from the around 2011, right? So these are countries where people have now reached a point where they're able to obtain a decent education, only to discover that when they enter the labor market, good jobs are in very short supply, and it's people who have privileged access, like social networks that sort of are able to sort of secure those good jobs. And people who finally manage to get a good education but don't have those social networks to tap into struggle to sort of obtain equitable access to those jobs, right? So a lot of inequality in the labor market makes that countries like Egypt and Tunisia have a sort of decent level of education mobility, but very low levels of income mobility given their level of
Or
education.
even South Africa and the UK have quite high
South
education.
Africa will be another example of
Very
yeah,
high.
reasonably high levels of education mobility, but poor levels of income mobility.
Okay.
So based on that, South Africa will be a candidate case study country, Egypt, Tunisia.
Yeah.
Another, I don't know if I have a slide. Yeah, another is
There are no sub-Saharan African countries there, right? No, there is Angola.
yeah. So here, what we're plotting is the relationship between child outcome and parent outcome. In this case, education, and I'm in the process of producing the same for income. So in the original Becker and Tom's work predicted a relationship like this, a concave relationship, right? They predicted that at low levels of parental outcomes, credit constraints will be a very important factor, right? So if credit markets were perfect, then they argue that poor families are able to borrow to invest in the child's education, which would mitigate to some degree the importance of economic background. But in most countries, credit markets are not perfect, and so that introduces a comparatively high levels of persistence among the poor, and these credit constraints will bite less sort of for richer households, and then sort of that sort of slope coefficient sort of slopes up. So that's the original thinking of Becker and Tom. So they predicted sort of this concave relationship. However, if you that framework that we use with sort of heterogeneity between elites and non-elites predicts the exact other way around. It predicts convex, right? Because the more elites enjoy higher returns to investments, higher returns to education, etc., which is associated with a greater slope. So if you believe in that story, it will be a convex relationship. And so inspecting the nature, the non-linearities potentially in that relation tells you something about sort of the underlying sort of mechanisms may be at play. So we were thinking of, well, inspecting exactly this. We identify some countries where this relationship looks clearly convex, some countries where it looks clearly concave, and pick some case countries on either side of that. Okay, that was in a nutshell this first project. I don't know if I still have 5 minutes or so, and if you're interested, I can give you like a few slides. I don't want to hold you here, but since you made this effort to come all the way over here, might as well take a few extra minutes. Okay, so just quickly, this is also a project on intergenerational mobility, but it's a project that focuses on global. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the work of Branko Milanovic. So he made a bit of a career for himself by trying to estimate global inequality in the world. So he keeps the world as one big country and evaluates sort of inequality in the world at large. And so this is a joint work with Branko, where now we try to estimate global intergenerational mobility, right? So we're going to treat the world as one big country. And then, having done that, we can also then address a second question is, what is the relative importance of the country you're born into versus the social class you're born into, right? If you focus on one country, it's a social class that's going to matter, right? Within the country, are you born poor parents or rich parents? But if you take a step back and you now view the world as your oyster, so to speak, right? First, you're born in a given country, and then within that country, you can be born into a poor, right? So you can be born into a poor, rich country, and then within the country, relatively poor or rich, so socioeconomic background. And we can investigate the relative importance of which one matters most for determining your position in the global income distribution. And so here, what we do is, this is the density plot of all the income elasticities that we observe across the world. That red line is the income elasticity we estimate for the world treated as one country. So the first empirical observation, which may not come as a big surprise, is that the world as a whole is less mobile than the average country in it. The average is is somewhere over here,
Mhm.
right? So the world as a whole is much less mobile than the average country. That should maybe not come into in part because now we have this additional factor that plays a role, maybe the country you're born into, right? And it turns out that the world as a whole is roughly as mobile as India.
And immobile.
Exactly. Now the second thing we want to do is that other question. So this is a slide I brought from one of Branko's presentations, which shows you the global income distribution at various points in time. And we're focusing, the children we're going to focus on somewhere around 2015. So a little, just shy of the green line here. And the question is how important is the country you're born into versus the social class within that country you're born into in determining where you end up in this global income distribution, right? That's the question we want to. Okay, so now we set up a very stylized sort of framework for addressing this. We're going to make a few assumptions that sort of helps us come up with a very simple stylized exposition way of addressing this question. Okay, so that's the top question is the equation that all of you by now will be familiar with, right? That's that standard intergenerational transformation equation, except now that we attach subscript C to the parameter, right? Alpha C, beta C, where C indicates the country. Okay, and T still indicates the generation, and I indicates the family within that country. Okay, we're going to make this additional assumption that incomes are log normally distributed. They're log normally distributed within each country, and they're also log normally distributed globally. Okay, so we're going to make a distributional assumption, which is if you inspect, I know many of you have inspected household income data. It's a remarkably sort of good approximation of available data. Okay, it means that log income satisfies this relationship over here, right? So we have the mean of log income in a given country C, the generation T, and this is the quantile function of the normal distribution. Okay, and this is the standard deviation of log income in that country. Now let Q define the parameter that determines the rank of the country that the person is born into, and you should think of it as it's going to be the median log income in that country for a family who is at the median social class, right? So the child is not born into rich, is not born into poor, is okay. So Q is very much a measure of the income ranking of that country. So we're going to use Q to indicate whether it's a rich country or a poor country. Okay, it's neutral on social class.
Sorry, this is when the child is born, right? Not when the parents are there.
So what we're interested in, where does the child end up in the global income distribution as a function of two parameters. One is the ranking of the country. So are you born into a rich country or poor country? And the second parameter, the social class. So
But the social class is defined at the country level, not at the global level.
At the country level, yeah, exactly. So within the country, so P 0.9 means that your parents are in the 90th percentile of your country.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And Q captures sort of the ranking of the country within the world.
Mhm.
Okay, for a family that is at this middle class, right? So there's going to be two parameters, Q and P. Q is country ranking. P is the ranking of the social class within your country. Okay. The question now is, given those two inputs, the income ranking of the country versus the income ranking of the parents within their country, how do those two coefficients determine the ranking of that child in the global income distribution? Now, if you make those assumptions, it turns out that we get this very clean expression for where the child is expected to end up. Okay, so R is the percentile of the child in the global income distribution. It's a function of two parameters. Q captures the ranking of the country. P, the social class within that country of the child, right? And there is only one parameter that governs the relative importance of QP. It's parameter. So this is a different gamma from the previous presentation. So don't get confused. Okay. So literally, there's a very clean expression. There's only one parameter, gamma, and that gamma tells you the relative importance of P relative to Q. Okay. So if gamma is low, right? So say gamma is 0, right? That's a country where there is very high income mobility, right? That the intergenerational income of 60 is say 0 in that country. Well, then your position is completely dictated by the country you're going to. Social class within your country makes no difference whatsoever in determining it. If that gamma is very high, then sure, the country you're going to plays a role, but the social class is going to play a role as well. Okay? And what is gamma? Gamma is that intergenerational income elasticity, but it's multiplied by the level of national income inequality divided by global inequality measured by the standard deviation of long income. Okay, so it's the ratio of national income inequality and it's normalized by global inequality. Basically, what this highlights is that in order to work out what is the significance of social class, you should not just be looking at the intergenerational income elasticity. It's very much the product of the income elasticity and national inequality that matters, right? If you're in a country where the income elasticity is really high, right? India, we know that India, the elasticity is around 0.6. That is really high by sort of global standards. But if you have an elasticity of 0.6, but there's almost no income inequality, it doesn't matter that there's 0.6, right? All children end up with the same income because all the parents have the same income, right? Having a really high elasticity is not going to generate any inequality in the child generation if all the parents were equal to begin with. Okay, so it drives from the point that you really need both of these to be high. If this is high but inequality is low, it gets modulated. If this is high and this is low, again, so you need both of those two. Now it so happens, remember, the great GISP speaker tells you that on average they do tend to be hand in hand, right? So countries where this is high also tend to be countries where inequality is high. But that's an empirical question, right? It doesn't have to be necessary. And there will be countries where that's not necessarily the case. And so I'll conclude with this slide over here. So what we did here is for a subset of countries, we try to make that point. What is the relative importance of social class versus the country according to? So how do we do that? Is we picked 8 countries with different values of gamma, as well as different values of sort of where the country ranks in income distribution. What we did is we plot the percentile of where a child is projected to end up in the global income distribution as a function of the position of the parents in the income distribution of their country. Right? And so you can see, for example, on the top we have Sweden and we have the US. So Sweden is very flat, right? So we know Sweden, we have a very low income elasticity. Social class doesn't really matter. You can be born to the poor in Sweden or the rich. You're all going to end up really high in the global income distribution. It's also reasonably flat for Indonesia, relatively speaking. Where it's not so flat is, say, Kenya. Kenya is this sort of line at the bottom, right? So if you're born to poor family in Kenya, you're all the way at the bottom of the global income distribution. But if you're born to parents that are at the top of the elites in Kenya, you're actually going to end up doing pretty well, right? You're managing to keep a very so social class matters. It may not matter in Denmark or Sweden or maybe Romania. Romania also is reasonably flat as a red line, but it matters a huge deal in Kenya. It also matters a huge deal in this country, the blue country, that is South Africa. Right? In South Africa, if you're born into the poor, you're all the way at the bottom of the income distribution. But if you're born among the elites in South Africa, you're right up there with the elites in Sweden. And so it just drives home the point that while on average, maybe the country born into probably dominates the social class you're born into, that's not to say that there are countries in the world where social class is hugely important in determining sort of your income system. Malaysia is somewhere in between. So that's the thicker line is what we find for Malaysia.
You know, a misunderstanding, maybe we can ask you after the seminar is over, like, still trying to wrap this, like, is it just like an art? Of course, on an average, Sweden is so rich that even the poorest person in Sweden does quite well, right?
Yeah.
And that's,
Yeah, that's exactly, yeah.
No, and so it doesn't really matter.
It matters, but far less, right? That slope of that line is comparatively weak. So if you look at the slope for, what's the other country? Where, Brazil, this Bordeaux color, right? It's another example. So South Africa is maybe the most extreme case in our data set, but Brazil is right up there with it, right? Brazil is another example of a country where it hugely matters if you where your parents sort of sit in the income ranking.
So, but I think your point was that by construction, if you're starting out with a high point, it has to be flat, right?
Exactly, that's what I'm saying. Like, the United States, for instance, is a good example of, I mean, that, I don't know how to put it, like, but I think what Shafat was saying is kind of getting to like, how much is mechanical, right? Because the United States, we do know it has low intergenerational mobility, relatively speaking, and of course, it's slightly below the Swedish line, but doesn't look so bad to be born poor in the United States, because relative to poverty in other parts of the world, you're not so badly off,
Mechanical to the extent if you might be able to relax that if you're going to relax the log normality assumption. But yeah, in a log normal world, if we're willing to assume that incomes are log normally distributed, yeah, if the median, yeah.
But what was the exchange rate? Not mechanically, but by construction of the measure. Of course, I think however they got it, it's definitely if you're starting off at a higher level.
But under a different distribution, it could differ, right? So you're right with the log normal distribution, but it's symmetric, right? So that line is going to be symmetric. So if the median family is very high, right? With a symmetric function that is dictated by the log normal, you're right. So then the poorest family is there's only so much scope for falling below. But with different distributional assumptions, this function doesn't have to be symmetric, right? So it could maybe increase slightly above the median, but it could fall rapidly below the median. But you would need I think a distribution assumption that allows for that.
Yeah.
And this is an exchange rate, right? It's not PPP.
This is PPP.
This is PPP.
This is PPP. Sorry, this is PPP. Yeah, I literally use Branko's data. Branko uses PPPs.
Okay.
Yeah. Having said that, the log normal assumption is not far off. You would expect the data. It might be a little bit off, but it may well be that it's off maybe at the tails, right? And it's precisely maybe that behavior, if you were to relax that and capture that better, that might introduce an asymmetry in that function that would allow that curve to sort of drop off, even for a country like Denmark. But I don't know how but yeah, the only way to allow for that is to introduce asymmetry in that function. And the only way to introduce asymmetry is by relaxing the log normality assumption and work with a different distribution assumption.
Okay.
I don't know how we're time-wise.
We are way. When something went over time. I think, okay, are there any really, really, really burning questions from us that you think you cannot just ask in an email to Roy, or that you want to get off your chest right now? So please chime in.
As you see, we are very inviting to ask questions.
Not then.
I'm gonna go for just for your information. I'm gonna go for a coffee. This finest classic coffee. I was thinking if that's okay with you, Tobias.
Oh yes, I mean it's also lunchtime. I don't know if you want to.
I was hoping maybe to first do a coffee and then maybe lunch.
You
And
have
then
your
if anyone
coffee
wants to join, coffee is on me today. And so if anyone has any further questions, I'm happy to take questions over coffee. Does that sound?
Okay,
That-
yeah,
that sounds
sounds good. Okay, then
Maybe you'll have a coffee, you'll be eating a bit of lunch.
there's lunch there too. Best quality.
And you the one in the corner, you mean, down
Yeah,
there?
Come on
yeah,
down- come on downstairs with the colorful chair.
Okay, so thanks everyone for coming. Thanks for all the people who joined us online. It was a really great talk. Thanks to Roy, above all.
My pleasure.
And just FYI, today I hope we will send out the invitation for Roy's workshop, which will be Monday, Tuesday next week. So please stay tuned to that. And I know this is really short notice, but I think this gives you a foretaste of what you can see, even though it will be about poverty more than inequality. But I think it will be a workshop very, very worthwhile attending. So please keep a close eye on your inbox. And thank you very much.
Thank you guys.
Yes? Oh, the survey. And do we have the survey oh, we don't have it on the slides. Yeah.
The World Bank is mentioned.
Okay, and then I think the online audience right now, we don't have the QR code, but please, people who are here in the audience, please please do the survey through the QR code. Thank you very much.